Das Radikal.
Last February, we uploaded a video about 5 unsolved disappearances that have happened in Iceland. In this video, I asked you to imagine that a person you have just said goodbye to were to then walk out of sight, only to be then never be seen or heard from again. This happens very rarely, of course. But what is even rarer, at least in Iceland, is that this person were to be then suddenly and violently struck down by a complete stranger for absolutely no reason at all. It is the human equivalency of being suddenly struck by lightning. Although it is rare, it is not entirely unheard of either. So in this video I was able to gather 5 true stories about disturbingly random murders that have happened in Iceland. Enjoy. Viewer discretion is advised. Ingólfur Einarsson was a 37-year-old blacksmith. He had a long history of mental illness and a police record for many petty crimes and also assaults, including for once attacking 2 young schoolgirls with an unknown weapon and wounding one of them. Due to his exploits, he had spent a large portion of his life both in jail and various mental institutions. In 1947, Ingólfur was unemployed and he lived in a tiny shack near Háteigsvegur. During those times, the most of the houses near Háteigsvegur were leftover army barracks that had been turned into cheap residential housing following the end of World War II. Cheap housing projects comprising of mainly army barracks were very common in Reykjavik during the 1940s, and they were often referred to as Sprakkahverfi. In the evening hours of May 3rd, Ingólfur was resting on his bed inside his tiny shack. Most of Ingólfur's neighbors were afraid of him, and for very good reason. He had often shouted insults at them, and he had sometimes also made threatening remarks toward the neighborhood's children. As Ingólfur rested on his bed, he could hear the neighborhood's children playing outside, and then, quite suddenly, in his own words, he could feel a deep desire within himself to go out and do something absolutely terrible. He then got up and dressed himself into his normal jacket and armed himself with a machete before heading outside. Ingólfur walked straight to the barrack that was closest to his shack and entered the unlocked front door. This particular barrack was the home of a 28-year-old Rósa Aðalheiður Georgsdóttir, her husband Kjartan, who was not home at the time, and their 2 daughters, Kristín and Sigríður, who were aged 2 and 8. As Ingólfur entered the living room, he first came across the 2-year-old Kristín, where she was sleeping quietly on the couch. He then made his way over to her and then began to repeatedly stab her with his machete. 8-year-old Kristín heard the noise and she quickly ran over and desperately tried to rescue her little sister, but Ingólfur then turned his fury against the 8-year-old girl and began to repeatedly slash at her with his sharpened blade. Rósa, who had been outside attending to laundry, heard the screaming coming from her house and quickly ran inside to see what was happening. She was then suddenly greeted by a machete-wielding madman who then turned his fury against her. Rósa tried to defend herself against Ingólfur's attacks, and while trying to defend himself against him, the very much wounded Sigríður was able to run outside of the house and onto the street. She then ran towards 2 children that had been playing outside and had come closer as they had heard the noise. Sigríður then collapsed onto the sidewalk in front of them, but one of the boys was able to run to his own house in order to get help. Meanwhile, her mother Rosa had been able to somewhat fight off Ingólfur and had managed to escape out into the street, although Ingólfur was still able to slash her in the back several times as he ran away. She still managed to get to her neighbor's house and pleaded to them to help them and call police. Two of Rosa's neighbors, Baldur Einarsson and Gunnar Guðmundsson, entered Rosa's home, where they were then confronted by Ingólfur. Despite being quite bloody, he appeared quite calm, and when they ordered him to disarm himself, he simply let the machete fall into the floor without any resistance. The two neighbors then grabbed Ingólfur, one from each side, and dragged him out into the car of another neighbor, and the three men then drove Ingólfur down to the police station. Both Rosa and Sigríður were moved to the hospital in a very critical condition. However, they did both survive. Sadly, however, the 2-year-old Kristín didn't make it. Ingólfur was found not guilty by reason of insanity. However, the Supreme Court of Iceland recommended that he be interned in the prison at Litlahraun due to his violent and unpredictable nature. He escaped from Litlahraun in 1954, but he was apprehended within 1 day. When he was eventually released in the early 1960s, he, however, refused to leave, citing that there was no place in today's society where he would be able to live comfortably, and he asked to be allowed to stay in the prison, and, amazingly, he was granted permission. Ingólfur died in the Litlahraun prison in 1969. Guðjón Atli Árnason was born in 1927, and during his early years he obtained a long police record for petty crimes such as theft and forgeries. However, during his 30s he eventually got his act together, and in 1976 he had not been arrested for any crimes for over 15 years. Monday the 5th, 1976. Guðjón Atli was at his cabin at Elliðavatn consuming alcohol when he seemingly got bored and decided to drive aimlessly into downtown Reykjavik. Guðjón eventually made his way to the BSE bus terminal, which at the time was a popular hangout spot for people driving aimlessly through the city at the time, I guess, because it was one of the few places that was open far into the night. It was there where Guðjón met 18-year-old Kjartan Sigtryggsson and 17-year-old Alexander Rögnvaldsson. Both teenagers were severely drunk at the time. Kjartan was a native of Akureyri and had, despite being only 18 years old, managed to get himself a hefty police record, mainly for petty crimes such as theft and check forgeries, while Alexander had at the time never had any run-ins with the police. They had recently met quite by chance and become friends, and Kjartan was staying at Alexander's place during the summer of 1976. The three men talked for a bit, and Guðjón even offered to pay for 3 hot dogs and 3 non-alcoholic beers out of his own pocket for them. After having eaten the hot dogs, Alexander recommended that they drove together to Breiðholt, as he claimed to know somebody there who might be able to supply them with alcohol if they paid for it. They then decided to drive up to Breiðholt, so they all got into Guðjón's van, with Guðjón being the driver and Kjartan seating himself in the passenger seat, while Alexander got into the back. As the three men were driving along Fífuhvammsvegur at the outskirts of Kópavogur, something happened. Something which I can only describe as incredibly impulsive. Kjartan suddenly attacked Guðjón, beating him in the head with a broken glass bottle, while Alexander then grabbed Guðjón from behind, and the two men continuously beat Guðjón while he tried to fight back while also driving the car. However, Guðjón was able to brake suddenly and then jump out of the car, but the two teenagers jumped out after him and attacked him. Guðjón tried to defend himself, however he was eventually overpowered by the two drunken teenagers who were able to beat him into unconsciousness. They then dragged the unconscious 49-year-old into the van and before getting into the car themselves and driving off. However, they had only driven a few hundred meters when they noticed that Guðjón was still alive, and one of them said that it was best that they finished what they had started. So the two men stopped the van and jumped outside. One of them grabbed a large rock that he found laying around, while the other opened the back door for Guðjón to get out. Guðjón then jumped out of the car, apparently still very much alive. However, he did not get far, as he then got the large rock thrusted right into his face. Guðjón then fell lifelessly onto the ground, and the two men grabbed two wooden planks that they had seen laying around and then started to severely beat the motionless man until they were thoroughly convinced that he was finally dead. After that, they simply tossed their murder weapons away, got back into the car and drove back to Reykjavik. They ended up ditching the car in Kaplaskjólsvegur and then wandered off into the night. The bloody corpse of Guðjón was found early the next morning by road construction workers, as they had been left only a mere few hundred meters from a road construction site. The police of Reykjavik later discovered the van belonging to Guðjón at Kaplaskjólsvegur, where they had left it, and they found it to be soaked with blood from the inside. But from this crime scene in the car, they were also able to pull the fingerprints of one Kjartan Sigtryggsson. Both young men were under arrest less than 24 hours after committing the crime, and it did not take them long to give a full confession. However, the exact motive for why they attacked Guðjón in the first place has never been adequately explained. Since Alexander was only 17 years old at the time of the crime, he received 8 years in prison, which is the maximum sentence that can be handed out to a juvenile. Kjartan, however, received 12 years behind bars. However, both men were convicted again less than a year later, this time for starting a fire at the Litlahain prison, which resulted in several prison guards needing to get treatment for smoke inhalation. Smoke inhalement? You know what I mean. Despite this, both men were eventually paroled as early as 1982. Kjartan, unfortunately, continued down a long and elusive path of crime. He has been arrested several times for crimes that have included theft and kidnapping. Despite this, he was able to father a child in 1983, and his son, in a bizarre twist of irony or perhaps fate, would follow very closely in his father's footprints and would himself be convicted of murder in 2006. Elmar Hreinn Sævarsson had started to show behavioral problems at an early age, and during his teenage years he spiraled into a long-lasting drug addiction and eventually also a long path of crime. He eventually made himself a long police record of drug-related crimes, thefts, and once got in prison for assault. He also attempted rehab several times, however, he always managed to get into this same old lifestyle sooner or later. In late November 1999, his drug use, however, seemed to go absolutely out of control, as he stayed continuously high on cocaine, ecstasy, amphetamines, while also consuming large amounts of alcohol, which he also used to wash down sleeping pills and Valiums. Due to some blunder of fate, his heart decided to somehow not simply give up, so he made his way to his mother's apartment, and she allowed him to stay over for several days. His mother would often allow him to stay over whenever he was down on his luck or between homes or between rehabs. Elmar, now alone, had been awake for more than 50 hours straight, and he suddenly started to experience a deep, overwhelming rage against the world but also against himself. In this state, he contemplated committing suicide, but he then realized that instead of harming only himself, he really wanted to harm himself by doing something so horrible that he would be punished as severely as anyone in his position could be punished for. He then grabbed a knife, which he hid on his body, and exited the apartment. He, however, did not go very far. He simply went across the hallway to the next apartment and knocked on the door. He was there greeted by an elderly woman. He told her some lie that he needed to use her phone because his was broken. She then led him into his apartment to use the phone, and it was only then that he realized that the old woman had several guests over, and he quickly realized that he would most likely not be able to do anything horrible without the guests being able to overpower him and stop him. So he simply pretended to use the phone and then said that he hadn't received an answer and politely thanked the old lady before heading back to his mother's apartment. He eventually exited the apartment for a second time, and this time made his way onto the floor below his mother's. He then chose a door at random and knocked on the door. Pretty soon, an 80-year-old woman opened the door for Elmar. The 80-year-old woman was Sigurbjörg Einarsdóttir, a native of Reykjavik. She was a widow, mother of 4, and had several grandchildren. Elmar used the same lie as he had used on his upstairs neighbors, and the woman asked Elmar to wait at the door while she went inside to get her wireless landline telephone. However, when Sigurbjörg returned to the entrance, he was surprised to see that Elmar had entered her apartment and closed the door behind him. And then, without warning, Elmar attacked the defenseless old woman and was able to beat her onto the ground before taking out the knife and then starting to savagely stab the woman in the neck and head. After having murdered the defenseless 80-year-old woman, Elmar was now in a complete state of fury. He eventually ransacked her apartment and vandalized much of her property before making off with a small amount of cash he had found laying around the apartment. Sigurbjörg's body was discovered by one of her sons just a few hours later. Once police arrived to the scene and started to interview neighbors, they quickly realized that a well-known petty criminal that they had often dealt with was the son of the mother living in an upstairs apartment. Thus, it did not take very long for the police to track down Elmar. Elmar was convicted to 16 years in prison. He was eventually paroled, and for some years he showed sign of great progress, as he had kicked most of his addiction problems and seemingly did not revert back into his old life of crime. That is, unfortunately, until 2011, when he was again arrested, this time for being involved in a serious case of assault and torture. He has since then continued to be a reoccurring guest in the Litla-Hraun prison. Þrándur Sigvaldason had gotten addicted to drugs at a young age. However, despite his addictions, he was still able to land himself a steady job on a large fishing vessel that harbored in Reykjavik. However, during the long lulls between its fishing trip, he would usually spend much of his time inland, consuming various amounts of alcohol and drugs, including ecstasy, cocaine, and amphetamines. It was the night of February 18th, 2002, when Þrándur realized that he had spent almost all of his cash on drugs and that it was still quite a while until he would go out fishing again, so he made a split-second decision to go and grab some more cash wherever he could. He had once been employed at a car repair shop in Ægisíða in Vesturbær, and he decided to head over there, planning to break into a window on the roof in order to then steal money from the safe, which he still knew the combination to. He quickly armed himself with a club hammer, a machete, and a meat cleaver, and then ran out into the night. The weather that night was quite nice. There was a thin, fresh layer of snow, almost no wind, and the temperature was just below freezing. One would consider this a pretty nice February winter night for Reykjavik. Bragi Óskarsson was a 51-year-old bus driver who lived in Vesturbær in Reykjavik. His friends and co-workers described him as a mild-mannered, intelligent, and hard-working individual. Quite by chance, at the very same time as Þrándur was leaving his home, Bragi was being dropped off by a co-worker near the University of Iceland. Even though Bragi's apartment was about 30-minute walking distance away from the university, he always preferred to walk the rest of the way on his way home. Due to a complete chance, both men happened to be walking in the exact same direction along a street named Víðimelur in Vesturbær. It was outside of house number 50 when the paths of the two men crossed. What happened next has never been adequately explained, not by Þrándur nor by the police who investigated the crime scene. But what we do know is that Þrándur randomly attacked Bragi with his meat cleaver and the club hammer. Bragi tried desperately to fight back, and we know due to fingerprints recovered from the machete that he apparently was able to hold on to the handle at some point during the struggle. However, Þrándur had received no wounds when later investigated. After having dispatched of the mild-mannered bus driver, Þrándur then collected his weapons and ran off into the night. He made his way to the car repair shop as he had planned and executed his break-in and burglary as he had also planned, and managed to get away just before security guards arrived at the scene. Early the next morning, a resident of Víðimelur discovered Bragi's body and called the police. When police arrived at the scene, one of the detectives noticed that the footprints in the fresh snow looked almost exactly like those he had previously photographed at the break-in point by the repair shop at Ægisíða, where Þrándur had just committed the burglary. After going through a list of current and former employees of the repair shop, it didn't take long for police to track down Þrándur, who had spent the night partying with some friends in an apartment in Breiðholt, and he was in handcuffs less than 12 hours after killing Bragi. Þrándur confessed to all charges and was convicted to 16 years in prison. Sigurðsson was a 52-year-old house builder who lived his entire life in Keflavik, later a part of Reykjanesbær. He was a married father of 4 and had several grandchildren. He was also an outdoorsman who liked to go hunting and fishing across Iceland. Erlingur Sæmundarson was a 29-year-old airplane technician. He was described by friends as being a seemingly normal guy, and he had never had any run-ins with the police. However, in 2009, the Icelandic banking crash hit Reykjanesbær, probably the hardest of all places in Iceland, as Reykjanesbær received the highest unemployment rate in the entire country. And Erlingur, like so many others, found himself without work. Having problems paying the bills on his new apartment, he eventually sank into a deep depression. A depression which he was only able to fight back by consuming large amounts of alcohol before eventually moving into harder drugs, including amphetamine. After having been unemployed for more than 5 months, Erlingur eventually lost his apartment and had to move in back with his parents, who also lived in Reykjanesbær. On May 6, 2010, Erlingur was invited to a party at a friend's place. At that point, he had been continuously awake and high on amphetamines for more than 48 hours. Coincidentally, at the very same time, Haukur was attending a party at his friend's place, which coincidentally was located very close to the parents' house of Erlingur. At around 3 a.m., Erlingur decided that it was time for him to head back to his parents' house and try to finally get some sleep. Around the exact same time, Haukur was saying goodbye to his friends at their place and was also preparing to go home walking. The weather that evening was calm and relatively warm, considering it was early May. Both men walked towards each other along a street named Bjarnavellir, and they came across one another outside of house number 10. According to the testimony of Erlingur, they both greeted each other friendly before passing each other and heading on their own separate paths. However, then suddenly, without warning, Erlingur was overtaken by a deep, uncontrollable fury. He quickly turned around and jumped after the 52-year-old drunken man and jumped at him from behind, pushing him onto the ground. Erlendur then started to mercilessly kick and beat the defenseless man as he was laying on the sidewalk. Haukur tried desperately to fight back, but eventually he ran out of breath. It was then that Erlingur started to look around for a possible weapon in order to finish off his victim. It was then that he noticed a loose flagstone in a nearby driveway. He ran over to the stone, lifted it up high above his head, and then smashed it down on top of the head of Haukur, who died instantly. After that, Erlingur quickly ran to his parents' home and went to bed. Early in the next morning, somebody delivering newspapers to the houses in Bjarnavellir came across the body of Haukur and quickly notified the authorities. Upon interviewing the neighbors, police found out that some of them had seen a suspicious, somewhat bloody man walking towards the house of Erlingur's parents. Erlingur was quickly woken up by the investigating officers and placed under arrest. He later made a full confession and also gave a glimpse into his peculiar psychiatric state at the time of the murder. You see, according to Erlingur's testimony, he had been molested as a child in Keflavik, and when he met Haukur while high on amphetamine and drunk on that fateful evening, he somehow got the idea into his head that Haukur was a child molester. Haukur and Erlingur had never met before in their lives. Erlingur confessed to all charges and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. So, that was a video about 5 random and peculiar murders that have happened here in Iceland. I hope you liked the video, like and subscribe and all of that, and I'll see you in some other videos later on. Take care.
Das Radikal.